So this is the first talk of my life where I could see my undergraduate dorm room from where I sit, which is a little distracting. Okay, so many of you are in professional schools and they teach ethics. And what I want to convince you of is that we've been kind of misdirected in teaching ethics, and that this room has more to offer about how we should be teaching ethics. Now, to get there, I'll get to the lots of people later on. To get there, I'm going to give you my quick history of the field of decision making, and I'd be delighted to hear your disagreements, but there's no time. But if we go back to the prior millennium, we had some normative theories that talked about how we should make decisions, and we had some descriptive work that told us how we did make decisions. And most of the people in the field, including Danny, would claim he's a descriptive researcher, that we're not in the prescriptive business, despite the fact that professional schools found the field so fascinating under the illusion that we had prescriptions to offer. Okay? And when we did try to make prescriptions, it was largely around debiasing, and Fischoff did a good job in '82 highlighting we don't know how to debias people. And I would say many decades later, we're just more convinced that we don't know how to debias people. But we've moved in the descriptive direction in two important ways. By sort of realizing that we don't know how to debias people, we know more about how to get people out of system one thinking into system two thinking, and system two thinking tends to be better. So that's sort of a good prescription, is to, for important stuff, get into a system two, and obviously choice architecture or nudging has been an important development. And this has basically occurred fairly recently, new millennium stuff, and that's really shifted the field into being a far more powerful, more useful field in terms of helping people make better decisions. So now all I want to do is sort of replicate that in the world of ethics, and highlight that on the normative side we have philosophy, who have a variety of normative theories about how we should make decisions, and all of these theories are far too demanding, that none of us can live up to the standards of these theories, and so a lot of us read them at some point and found that that's kind of annoying, because utilitarianism, which is certainly my favorite, sort of you just feel bad for all the reasons that you're not utilitarian enough, and if you like the ontology or libertarianism more, you still can't live up to the standards, so those kind of get frustrating. And on the descriptive side, we have a bunch of descriptions that really weren't oriented to providing answers to the question of how do we get people to behave more ethically, which seems to be why ethics has taken off as a topic in this millennium, even though we don't seem to know how to do it. I would also highlight that there's no evidence for teaching people philosophy having any effect on ethical behavior, and I don't think preaching or having people talk about 30 cases of ethical behavior has any evidence that that's a good strategy either. So what can we do? We can do a lot of what we just did in the prior slide, and if we think about how to get people to behave more ethically, or what I might call practical utilitarianism, I think there's a couple things we could do. We could get people to move out of system one thinking into system two thinking, because system two thinking is not only smarter than system one thinking, it's also more ethical. And the other thing we can do is to nudge ethical behavior. And that's what I'm going to spend most of my time on, because I have 2 minutes left. And one thing we can do is we could get people to compare options in life rather than look at single options. And we know that, I'm talking about the Bonet et al. Paper, that when people compare two or more employees, they use performance-based criteria rather than gender-based biases in order to make their decisions. So joint leads to both hiring better employees in a way that's less sexist. And we could also potentially use veil of ignorance. So one of the choices society will confront is, what do you want an autonomous vehicle to do if it has to make a choice between killing the driver or killing the 5 pedestrians that they're going to hit? People who buy cars might like to protect the driver. Society might want a different option. If we're thinking about what kind of program we want the car to have, it might be useful to imagine that in that scenario that I just described, that that if you're one of those 6 characters, there's a 5 out of 6 chance you're one of the 5 pedestrians rather than the driver. And when people think about this problem under a veil of ignorance, all of a sudden they're more in favor of saving the greatest number of people. So the veil of ignorance moves us in a more utilitarian direction, which doesn't necessarily translate into a more ethical decision for all of us. It does for me. And finally, pre-commitment to objectives. And what we show in this line of research is, excuse me, is that if you're going to evaluate an employee, and there's a chance that you might be biased in ways that we wouldn't necessarily approve of, what we show is that we reduce sexism in the hiring decision if we have people first think about what it is that you value in the candidate that you're about to meet. Okay? And when people think about what do they value, they think about logical bases for hiring people, such as performance-based criteria, and that leads to less sexism, and as a result, they hire better employees as well. Okay, so anyhow, my time's up. Here's some ideas on how we can use the kinds of tools we think about here to come up with a more empirically justifiable way of improving ethics in our professional schools. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about why it is that we're not better at changing our own behavior. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about, but I think it takes on additional meaning after the data that Katie presented this morning. There's sort of a meta level at which we don't understand how to change people's behavior. There's many reasons why you can come up with why we're not better at understanding our own behavior and ways to change it. Self-serving biases, all sorts of things. I'm going to argue that there's actually a more structural reason for this. And that is that science is showing us that many of our actions are actually a product of both automated associations as well as more deliberate, conscious decisions and preferences. And if you think about this, it suggests that there might actually be a difference in the information that we have access to as individuals. So we're consciously aware of our intentions, our deliberate intentions. We may not be so aware of the more automated processes that also drive many of our common behaviors. So Asaf Mazar, who is a graduate student, and I started out asking some very simple questions to college students. The first one was, so after an exam, why would you purchase food? And we gave them 2 options. One was their mood. They might feel, right, like they had succeeded, and so they might be trying to sort of congratulate themselves, or they might be feeling bad, and so they're trying to compensate. And another is that they might have a habit to go out and purchase something after they take an exam. And these are their actual ratings, and you can see that they are weighting mood and habit about equally. That's fine. So then we contacted them again after a very difficult midterm exam, and we asked them for their current mood. The next day we contacted them and we asked them if they had purchased any food after the exam. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to predict, now we know what their beliefs are about these 2 possible causes. We wanted to use these causes to predict their behavior, which one would actually drive what they do. So we have post-exam mood, and then we had a measure, I didn't do this before, we also asked them at the beginning of the semester, what is the habit strength for purchasing food after an exam? And these are the data. So on the vertical axis is the likelihood of them purchasing food. And on the horizontal axis, you can see people who have weaker habits to do it, people who have stronger habits to do it. And then you can see the 3 lines for mood. And essentially what these data are telling us is mood makes no difference, right? Instead, people with stronger habits are more likely to purchase food. People with weaker habits are less likely. So we have a theory, people's lay beliefs, that emphasize both habit and mood, but we have the actual behavior from these same people, which is just the behavior is due to habit. So it seems that people are misattributing the causes of their behavior, that these kind of common everyday behaviors, they tend to overestimate what they can introspect about and underestimate the role of habit, the less accessible associations that are driving the behavior for some of these students. So these data were a little surprising to us. They were a bit more extreme than we had expected. We pre-registered, but we didn't think there'd be no effect of mood, right? And in fact, I should say that for our participants with stronger habits, they thought that their behavior was even more likely due to mood than people with weaker habits. So this seems to be a real misunderstanding, a miscalibration for people who have habits. So we could come up with all kinds of reasons why maybe we chose some weird, particularly weird behavior. Maybe people aren't paying attention to what they're doing after they take an exam, they're stressed out, or maybe their moods are just sort of fleeting. It's not as easy to interpret them. I'll maybe take two. So we decided we'd study an even more common behavior, which is drinking coffee. And the two most common reasons why people drink coffee, it turns out, at least in their reports, are low energy and fatigue, as well as habit. So we ran a similar kind of a design. We had coffee drinkers. These were either people who drank coffee frequently or only occasionally. And we had them tell us why. Why did they drink coffee? You can see that they're heavily weighting, shouldn't say overweighting, they're heavily weighting their tiredness and energy level. They're not giving much weight to habit. Then we ran an EMA study where every 2 hours they reported how tired they were and also whether they had drunk coffee since the last report. Now we included measures of whether they had eaten, whether they drank soda, so that they weren't focused on this coffee thing. And our design again was predicting coffee drinking. What predicts coffee drinking? To do this with the EMA data, we have tiredness at time 1 predicting coffee drinking at T-1. Other way around. Yeah. Tiredness at T1 predicting coffee drinking at T2. Okay. All right. And this is what we found. That, again, it's primarily habits that drive whether we drink coffee. And it's only for people with weak habits that there's any evidence that energy level or tiredness actually predicts coffee drinking. Again, we just didn't believe that these data, they seemed just a little too clear to us. So we did a couple of things. We asked the same participants to go back and tell us for the week of the study what was the primary driver of their behavior, and we said we'd pay them a lot of money if they were accurate. They still couldn't tell us. We tried lots of different ways of calculating habit strength. It didn't matter. You get the same results. So essentially, what we're finding is that we don't really understand many of the reasons for our common repeated actions. We tend to overestimate the things that we can introspect about, our preferences and our intentions. We tend to underestimate the less accessible, less consciously accessible associations that often drive our behavior. And where we're taking this is we believe that this may be one reason why people don't always choose effective change strategies, is we don't know what's causing the behavior in the first place. Thank you.
So this talk will extend some of the themes that David introduced in talking about the national study. When children come to school, they come to school in a social and historical context. And that context raises questions for children. It raises questions for children and for all of us about what our experiences will be like there, what we can expect, how we will be received and treated. And our country has in its past, as a major part of education, a history of exclusion on the basis of race and social class and other factors. And that history can give rise to questions in students. Questions like, am I the kind of person who can come to belong and succeed in school in America? And when people have that question, when people come into school asking themselves that question, it changes the lens that they have as they look out on the stream of social experience that they face on a daily basis in school. For a college student who's wondering, can people like me belong in college? Feelings of loneliness might seem to imply that the answer is no. Critical feedback from an instructor might seem like the answer is no. And a poor grade might seem like the answer is no. When Bob talked earlier about the football team entering the stadium and the crowd roaring with approval as something that matters to people, this too is something that really matters to people. This too is something that really drives people and shapes how they make sense of and how they respond to social experience. And so when people start to draw that inference, when they have challenges and they start to draw the inference that maybe this means I or people like me don't belong here, they can begin to withdraw. If you start to think that you don't belong in a setting, if it's a school setting, if it's a professional setting, and you're feeling like you don't belong there, it's harder to reach out and build relationships with other people. So to intervene upon this, my colleagues and I have made efforts to represent belonging as not a fixed quality, you either belong or you don't, but as a process that you develop over time to get people out of a mindset in which they make sense of that stream of social information with a yes-no perspective. Does this mean I belong? Does this mean I don't belong? And instead into a process mindset in which people understand belonging is something that takes time and effort to develop, that they have a role in cultivating, and thus to ask themselves, how can I develop my belonging in this space? What is the community that I can belong in, that I can belong with in this social world? And we deliver this intervention through relatively simple means. We tell people stories, and the stories come from older students in their middle school, older students in their college, older employees at their workplace, that convey the basic truth that everybody worries at first about whether you belong when you come to a new environment, and that gets better with time. We then enlist people in the storytelling process themselves, and they tell their own story along the same lines. In the original trial at a highly selective institution, we delivered this intervention in a 1-hour exercise in the first year of college in a laboratory session. We then track students' outcomes here, term by term GPA, through the rest of college. And here the interest was really in African American students who are entering a school world in which their group is underrepresented and faces negative stereotypes. What you see here is that African American students in the control condition show essentially a flat line. They don't show growth in GPA from the end of their freshman year through their senior year. But in the treatment condition, they show a term-by-term improvement, as though each term they're gaining new resources, new psychological resources, new confidence in their belonging, new social resources, new peer relationships, new mentor relationships that helps them to navigate and sustain success in a challenging environment. And overall, that treatment then reduces the black-white achievement gap in college by 52% over that 3-year period. And because we're talking about something that is so important as people's sense of belonging in their valued university, we see effects on outcomes like self-reported health and happiness. Now, in subsequent research, we've interrogated more closely how it is that a brief exercise could produce such lasting change in people's lives. And in part to do that, we followed up with our participants from this original trial and asked them about their adult lives. Now they're in their mid to late 20s at the average age of 27. And what we found was that with treatment, Black adults are reporting greater career satisfaction and success, greater psychological well-being, and greater involvement in their communities and community organizations. And we further found that those effects arose statistically, at least, through mentorship, through greater mentorship that students reported developing in college. People, African-American participants in our sample who received the treatment reported developing more mentors in college, more mentorship that lasted after college, and that predicted these long-term gains. So that means that addressing a psychological worry, a pervasive worry about belonging in the critical transition to college, helped people build these relationships that transform the trajectory of their lives into adulthood. We've replicated this and extended this in many other contexts with women in male-dominated engineering fields and scaling studies through online modules and first-year writing classes to students exiting urban charter schools, entering public flagship and private universities, attending majority-minority broad access universities, entering middle school. In all of these cases with school-reported outcomes lasting a year or longer. But what I want to emphasize in closing is that the ground really, really matters here. What we're doing with an intervention like this, just as with the national study, is we're offering people an idea. We're offering people a representation of their relationship with a space. And does that space afford that way of thinking? Can you be the kind of person that the intervention is suggesting that you could be in that environment? And that is, the proposal here is that change requires both a high quality seed, a psychologically adaptive belief system, and a conducive soil, a soil in which that seed can grow, in which that belief can be experienced in authentic and adaptive ways. And we see this in our trial through the College Transition Collaborative. This is a trial conducted with 22 partner colleges and universities across the country. You can see that these schools are extraordinarily diverse, from some of the most selective institutions in our country to very broad access institutions, from big public universities to very small colleges. And in this trial, what we have done in a pre-registered analysis is to look at the level of belonging that students who do not receive the treatment experience at a given college, from a given race ethnicity background, from a given first-generation status background in the spring term. So by the spring term, do people like you come to feel like you belonged? And if we look at schools where there's less opportunity for people like you to belong, there's, if anything, negative treatment effects. That's not significant, but if anything, the trend is not positive. But when we look at the institutions that do offer greater opportunities for belonging for people like you at your school, then we see significant treatment effects on the educationally important outcome of completing the first year full-time enrolled. So these concerns about belonging arise as reasonable responses to our sociocultural context and history. They shape how we make sense of daily experience. And this is a way in which psychology mediates the reproduction of inequality in our society. And it's an opportunity for us to interrupt that mediator, to interrupt that reproduction of inequality. What we call wise psychological interventions can give students authentic and adaptive ways of making sense of challenges they face, to transform people's lives, and yet they depend essentially for their effectiveness on the affordances of context, on fertile soil in which those ideas can live. I just want to end by flagging this, which is a repository of more than 325 psychologically wise interventions, all tested with randomized controlled trials in very diverse spaces that people can access freely. Thank you.
So thanks for inviting me. What an intimidating audience for a behavioral researcher, by the way, just seeing everyone I'm scared of. So I thought that we would start with a little thing. So can everybody please stand up? Afternoon session. Okay. Even Max. And let's do this task, okay? So think for a moment about your either your evening routine or your morning routine. Do you either brush your teeth and then take a shower, or do you take a shower and then brush your teeth? So raise your hand if you're A. Raise your hand if you're B. Raise your hand if you refuse to raise your hand.
Brush your teeth in the shower saves time.
So that's a whole other gross thing that's beyond the scope of my. So now, by the way, it's typically like 30, 70% one way or the other. It's never 100. Keep that in mind. So now, simulate yourself doing your thing. Now, in your mind, switch the order. And now think, if I asked you to switch the order, would that bother you in any way? Raise your hand if it would bother you in any way. Raise your hand if it would not. Yes, that's usually like 50-50 as well. So that would be funny if I just stopped there. But there's there's a lot of ways to think about the difference between habits and rituals, but that's one that I like. So you could say that you have a habit of brushing your teeth and showering. Like those are the tasks that you get done. And some of you don't care what order they go in. You need to do those two things, and that's what you do. That's kind of like more on the habit end of the continuum. And other people care about the order. And that moves it a little bit. It's the right way to do it. And when you think of doing it the other way, it's wrong. And when you see people do it the other way, you think there's something wrong with them. That means it's a little closer to kind of a ritual. And the other nice thing about habits and rituals is that habits tend to be like sort of dry or boring. It's like a task to be done and then you check it off. And rituals actually are more engaging and emotional. So when you do your ritual in the right way in the morning, you've got like a little pep in your step for the day. You kind of feel like, yep, ready to go now because I did my shower and my teeth. Even though half of people are like, nope, I feel better because I did it in the other direction. So one of the things we've been looking at for quite a few years is what is the psychology of rituals? They're so ubiquitous across domains of life that we thought there must be something to them in terms of the impact that they have on the humans. And I'll talk today about specifically the impact on self-control. Because the other thing is that they can be kind of fun. Like exercise, at least for me, as you may have noticed, not fun. But if you stand up and clap and stomp with other people, more fun. There's something about that that's like kind of more fun. And one thing we thought is, can we harness that? Like the ritual part is more engaging, more fun. Maybe we can harness that so that people will engage in better habits. By the way, every time I do that, people start by being not in sync, and then they sync up, which is totally interesting to me. Then you get mad at people who are doing it at the wrong time. What's this guy up to over here? Even though there's no right way to do it. And it speeds up also, like, yeah, we're getting good at this. Anyway, I don't know why that's not related to the talk, but okay, so here's what we did. We wanted to get people to eat carrots. So we thought, what's a healthy food that is okay, but not really something that people love? So we said, can we use rituals to make people like eating carrots? And I'm not gonna make you do this one, because it gets annoying. But the idea is that we create rituals for people. They're usually based on rituals that we see in the world, like knock on wood is a thing that the humans have come up with. And the way we do it is, so one feature of rituals is that they're repetitive, right? So when you repeat something, actually, that makes it feel more ritualistic for people. So we give them a plastic bag of carrots and we say, take it out. We say, make a fist, knock on the table. Take the bag, use your right hand, knock again, take a deep breath, and now eat a carrot. That's step one, okay? Then there's a second plastic bag. We say, do the same thing, thank you. Do the same thing, take a carrot, and then do this ritual and then eat it. And then the tricky part is, we say a third bag, and before you can eat the carrot, we say, stop. How excited are you about that carrot? And people are like, I'm kind of excited right now. Because they got in the thing and they feel like they're excited. So they're actually excited to eat it, and when they eat it, they like it a little bit more. Then the other conditions where we do the science and control for stuff. We don't want to get into that right now. Do they love carrots? No, but they like them more when they're in this mindset. So that's part is they can enjoy it. And then the other thing that we did was, can we get them to choose carrots? So enjoying them is nice, but we have to make you actually pick the carrot first. So very similar setup in another project. The ritual was slightly different, but the basic idea was the same. Now, after the second carrot, we say, stop. Do you want a carrot or do you want chocolate? And people are slightly more likely now to pick the carrot than they would be if they hadn't done the ritual. I should say that we've tried many domains of self-control, and they don't all work. So we haven't been able to move financial decision-making with rituals. I don't have a good theory for why, but they're not sort of magical, but it seems like in some domains they can shape our psychology in interesting ways. Okay, so last slide. So we started out, all this research is with Francesca Gino and then many, many other colleagues. We started out kind of saying, like, what is a ritual? What are the properties of them, and repetition, and all these sorts of things? And across lots and lots of projects now, today I talked about consumption, like we like carrots more, and also self-control. But across tons of other projects, we've been seeing that ritual, first off, they're ubiquitous. We just ask people, do you do a ritual when you do X? And like half of people say, yep, and they tell us what it is. And when we randomly assign people, it seems to have a real influence on their thoughts and feelings. Sometimes on their behavior, that's harder as we all know, but almost always on their psychology. So I think there's sort of an interesting trigger that we haven't used very much that mean a lot to people that might actually change their behavior. I'm done. Thank you.
So I'll ask about habits. So if I do something and I just tell you that I do it, I'm not sure why. Like why do you drink coffee? I don't know. I just drink coffee. Versus I say I have a habit. Theoretically, what's the distinction?
There are two levels to answer that, I suppose. Your behavior could still be habitual, right? So the behavior itself could run off in a habitual way, whether you recognize it or not. And I think that's the point of what we were trying to demonstrate, is that our beliefs are decoupled from at least the automated parts of the drivers of our behavior. So whatever you think is fine, your behavior is probably, if you are a habitual coffee drinker, your behavior will probably be controlled by those cues and rewards.
Yeah, I guess let me explain. Like I'm trying to see how can we distinguish the habits, which is often a good thing, often something that we try to establish, from the I do it because I do it. I actually don't know why I do it. Okay, you might know that I do it because there was a nudge or there was like something. I don't know that, so I say, well, this is just my habit. Like this is how I.
Well, if you do it just once, if it's a one-off, then you're right. Neither you nor I might know why you're doing it. But if you're doing it on a regular basis and it becomes automated, so your experience is as automated, and it's in response to a cue, then the behavior itself is driven by habit. You can keep whatever theories you want about your behavior.
So just to clarifying on Ayelet's point, if you point something out to someone and they change it, is that related to whatever we want to call a habit? So suppose someone adds the word like at random throughout their conversation, and you say, do you realize you say like every 30 seconds? Oh no. And so is that a habit? Is that a ritual? Or are they just doing it?
Well, I would say that you have pointed that out to them, and they will probably deliberately control that response.
While I'm present.
While you're present for the next
Maybe.
5 minutes. And then they'll get involved in what they're saying, and my guess is the habit will come back. That's what we usually see, at least because that deliberate control is much less resilient than the habit itself is. Habit memories tend to stick. They're not. They can be controlled in the short run. They're harder in the long run. Do you think it's a ritual?
Saying like. I think I do it a lot, so I feel personally. I do think I was hearing your question, Ayala, partly as if I say it's a habit or not. So I might drink coffee every morning, or I might say I have a habit of drinking coffee, or you could say I have a ritual of drinking coffee, and just the labeling might change the feeling around it and your susceptibility to behavior change. And that I'm not sure has been
Yeah,
studied, just the.
In our research, we find it doesn't, that your beliefs about your behavior don't really matter. If that's that disconnect, the decoupling the behavior.
It sounds like a habit is I own it. And a ritual is not only I own it, I also I will protect it. It's important.
Yeah.
Okay, I say like because I like saying
Yes,
No, you're not saying like that.
if it's part of your identity, I mean, that could be yet another reason, right, for maintaining it. You're a valley girl. It's always like this.
He had a question.
Who's in charge?
Go for it.
Thank you, Adam.
So I wanted to dig a little deeper into that. I think going beyond the habit is commonly used, but rather thinking about authenticity as in a triggered behavior based on the environment. And in particular, Mike, I wanted to understand, you mentioned, okay, habit versus ritual, but it seemed like the interventions you were using were relatively short-term inducements of a complex behavior. Did you do anything longer term to see if there really is a level of authenticity to it? In other words, are these similar mental mechanisms?
It doesn't. It's a great question. It doesn't seem like a strong distinction between rituals and habits is awareness of them or automaticity of them. So some rituals you do, like brushing your teeth first and then showering, is not a ritual like a ceremony with thousands of years of history, obviously. But if changing the order bothers you, it's a little bit ritualistic. Most of you probably had never thought of your morning thing as anything, either a habit or a ritual. So often it's a little bit related. When you point it out to people, then they start thinking differently about it. But it's not super clear that the awareness of it is a strong differentiator, even though it's an important factor in understanding them.
Because the one distinction between those two might be the nature of the external cue and whether it is something that's flexible in your environment or not. It may feel wrong because you have a different set of cues, right? If you dig deeper into the mechanism of why someone has a habit.
That's
Just
interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious, how do you think differently, I'm just thinking about a comment David made to me while we were on break. How do you think differently about starting something, forming a habit, or making a choice, choosing this versus that, versus stopping something? When you think about what you talked about the board, I think David's comment, I don't want to misquote you, but it's easier to get people to think about an interest about starting something than stopping something.
Is that for me? Anybody?
Everyone.
Okay. Well, I think that if you're thinking about starting a habit, then you are thinking about repeating a behavior until you have laid down that habit memory. And that takes time because habits just accumulate over time. Whereas if you're thinking about stopping a habit, that habit memory is still there. And so you can make a decision to do something different, but when you're not paying attention, then the habit comes back. So they both have to do with habit memory and the difficulty, right, in forming habits and persistence and resilience of habits once they form.
It's kind of interesting to think about, if I'm going to start running, am I starting running or am I stopping not running? Like what's
It is one the inverse of the other.
Yeah,
New cues and you're starting running.
a fresh start, if you will.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess I want to channel like partners out in organizations that are dealing with real world problems, and one of the things I hear a lot is massive inequalities is harder than ever to really have open mobility, right? Massive increases in depression, stress, suicidality, right? Rise of totalitarianism and so on. And one of the premises for this event, and since the Freakonomics in 2017, is right, the world's kind of thorniest problems. And I'm trying to imagine how we get somewhere given the results today, and how hard it is to get anything except a few things that maybe have already been tested to work. So I guess I'm just kind of curious to the panel, like, are we doing the research right? That's one question. What's the vision for how we get to some of the problems that society really believes in us, and that people set aside academia in a way as a special place to do science to try to solve hard problems. So I'm just kind of curious, as a theme across the how are we going to get to what we want to do and what we aspire to, and what people are kind of counting on us to do.
I guess I thought John Shears, to some degree, addressed this. So we're not picking one strategy. There's lots of strategies, and they may well be additive. And you can add to the mix of I heard John talking about strategies that create an option for the individual in a variety of ways. You could add to it regulatory solutions. And it may well be that for the kinds of problems you're talking about, choice architecture, it doesn't come close to being enough. That we also need to change laws and create a social movement that go beyond what we're doing in the room. But that doesn't mean we don't do all the things that people have been talking about in the room.
I think that Bob's point about the football stadium at the beginning is really important. Like, what are the problems that are really problems for people? Like, that people really face challenges, where people are really struggling. And we have kids not far from here who are, struggling in 9th grade, and if they don't do well in 9th grade, they may not graduate from high school, and that's a very, very serious problem. You've got really serious health circumstances for people, for young adults. You've got like serious, racial, ethnic divides, political, partisan divides in our society. Like, these are things people think about. These are things that are like live wire things. This is like the football stadium when the team comes in, and we need to be looking at these kinds of problems, I think.
Kevin?
Mike's example of you toothbrush and then brush your teeth and then shower versus shower and then toothbrush your teeth, I think it's very
Which one are you,
striking
Kevin?
because
Everyone wants to know which one you are. Can you just
well,
tell us?
not only that, but it's very very possible to contemplate doing the opposite. And I think it highlights something which we've perhaps underappreciated, which is that if we're trying to achieve sustained behavior change, we have to undo sustained behavior change. So, we all have these lasting or really sticky habits. And that's sort of a funny example because the outcome's exactly the same. It's obviously much harder if you're trying to turn a non-gym goer into a gym goer, and all the things in their environment which conspire to make them a non-gym goer. You have to figure out how to undo those habits to form this new habit. And I'm wondering if the panel could comment on relative energy spent on forming new habits versus trying to undo some existing habits which might conspire to spread out the potential for new habits.
Jump in.
The burden of expertise.
So I think that one way I think about this is that if behavior change is a multi-component process, part of it is taking the things that you do automatically and making them more difficult, so you have to think about it. And if they become more difficult, so like if you're trying not to check your phone, you turn your phone off. Just so you have to, it's harder. It's more of a commitment then to turn it on again, but it also gives you an opportunity to think, is this what I want to do? So it gives you an opportunity to sort of be reminded of the better behavior. And then you want to try to set up whatever the new behavior is to be as easy as possible and as rewarding as possible following Eilid's work, so that you quickly start forming that into a new habit. So I do think it's a multi-component process, but it's really, you can think of it just as sort of a system 1, system 2 challenge, and altering where the automaticity is and where the thought is coming in. And that's not the way we typically think about behavior change, right? When we go to change our behavior, we just try to exert willpower. And so we're making the new process thoughtful and effortful. And that's really not what we want to do. We want to make the new behavior easy and rewarding so that it forms into a habit. The old one, more challenging. That an answer? I'm not giving you the relative importance of both, but
My query comes directly from what David was saying. It seems that we've seen many interventions that have been incredibly powerful, but also we have evidence that the 19 tried here did not work. I wonder about, are we organized, and my question is, some people do nudge research, some people do kind of consequences for others, other people do mindset, some people do method contrasting and implementation tension. Do we need a meta-theoretical perspective that kind of says, for this behavior and this group of people in this context, actually you should nudge? Or whereas for this behavior, in this context, you need to do meta contrasting with implementation intentions. Do we see a prospect of we as a group of behavioral sciences reaching the point where we can begin to create kind of some dimensions about when and under what circumstances this is the sort of intervention we should do?
So I wrote a psych review article last year with Tim Wilson called Wise Interventions. And that article distinguishes 3 different ways to conceptualize the sort of causes of social problems, social and personal problems, and 3 different ways to begin to address those. They all exist. So one approach is to attribute the problem to something in the objective circumstance. And it might be lack of resources, it might be a lack of an adequate basic incentive structure, or it might be things that we often think about in the nudge kind of rubric. So things like the defaults aren't set up in ways that are conducive to personally and socially beneficial behaviors. There are lots of problems of that sort. There are of all of those kinds of sorts where there are sort of objective deficits within situations that can be remedied, and the remedy of those could improve outcomes within those situations. A second kind of problem in that paper was attributing the problem to problems in the person. So the person lacks adequate executive function. The person isn't intelligent enough. The person has sort of persistent, like automatic racial biases. And what do we do about those problems? Well, one of the things we do with school, right? One of the big functions of school is to teach kids executive function, to help build kids' intelligence. And we know that schooling causally impacts IQ development. And those are a valuable aspect of that approach, is that those are then things that a person has that they can take, the resources a person has that they can take to many different problem spaces to function more effectively in different problem spaces. But a third kind of problem are problems that involve the person and the situation, that are essentially involve both of them. And that often involves how the person is making sense of the situation that they're in, the mindsets that they have, how those mindsets come about from social context and from history, how those mindsets change how they interpret and then respond and then experience a different kind of social circumstance as a function of the way that they interpret it in the first place. And and the growth mindset intervention, the belonging intervention, many other interventions are in that space. When we do that, we can start to understand the causal effects of those interpretations and the agency of people through their interpretations to change the circumstances of their lives. So that's one way to begin with that. So I think excellent question.
I wonder also, can I add one more thing, Angela?
You may.
All right.
First, you want to 4 minutes.
No, the question just made me think that I feel like most of the discussion about habits and nudges has dealt with pretty automatic behaviors. When it comes to more intentional long-term behaviors, I feel like we're supposed to have a theory that addresses that already, the theory of planned behavior, right? And I think when you apply that theory to a lot of this discussion, it seems like we've done a really good job mapping the psychology that leads to planned behavior, right? We know about perceived behavioral control and subjective norms and how those channel into intentions, I don't think we ever stop to say, well, what's actually in the behavior box? And should we actually be classifying different types of behavior that might be affected differently by intentions? And this continuum, obviously, of planned to spontaneous or habitual is one dimension. I wonder what the others are, and it feels like there are some people mildly qualified in this room to solve that.
Great. I'm going to keep us on time, which means that we have a chance to applaud loudly for the panel.